The phenomenon of industrialization, a transition that fundamentally reconfigured the global economic and social order, finds its genesis in the specific and contingent historical context of 18th century Europe. To understand this transition is to move beyond a simple narrative of technological invention and instead to apprehend a complex, multifaceted process wherein a unique confluence of preconditions, incentives, and structural changes coalesce to ignite a self-sustaining cycle of economic growth. The early history of European industrialization is not merely the story of the steam engine. It is the story of an agricultural revolution that freed labor, a commercial revolution that expanded markets and capital, a proto-industrialization that developed crucial organizational forms, and an intellectual enlightenment that fostered a culture of practical innovation. This transformative process, while pan-European in its underlying currents, first achieved critical mass in Great Britain, creating a template that would, often violently, reshape the world. The foundations of industrialization were laid not in the factory, but in the field. The agricultural revolution, a gradual process unfolding over the preceding centuries, was a necessary precondition for sustained industrial growth. Changes in farming practices, such as the adoption of the Norfolk four-course system of crop rotation, which eliminated the need for fallow land by integrating nitrogen-fixing crops like turnips and clover, dramatically increased agricultural productivity per acre. Simultaneously, the process of enclosure, particularly in England, whereby common lands were consolidated into privately owned, fenced fields, created larger, more efficient farming units. While socially disruptive, displacing smallholders and rural laborers, enclosure encouraged investment in land improvement and the application of new techniques. The consequence of these agricultural advancements was twofold. First, they generated a food surplus capable of sustaining a rapidly growing non-agrarian population concentrated in urban areas. Second, they created a pool of surplus labor, landless agricultural workers and displaced peasants, who would provide the workforce for the nascent industrial towns. Without this release of labor from the land, the factories of Manchester and Birmingham would have remained stillborn. Parallel to the transformation of the countryside was the expansion of commerce and the accumulation of capital. The commercial revolution, spanning from the 16th century onwards, had woven a dense web of long-distance trade connecting Europe with the Americas, Asia, and Africa. This trade, often monopolistic and fortified by state power through mercantilist policies, generated immense fortunes. The profits from the transatlantic slave trade, the plantation economies of the Caribbean, and the import of luxury goods from the East flowed into European port cities like London, Bristol, and Liverpool. This capital was not merely hoarded. It was increasingly channeled into a developing financial system. The establishment of central banks, the proliferation of joint stock companies, and the growth of a sophisticated credit network provided the mechanisms for mobilizing savings and directing them towards productive investment. Furthermore, the vast and growing colonial markets provided a reliable, often captive outlet for manufactured goods, creating a powerful demand pull for increased production. The quest to satisfy these expanding markets placed a premium on methods that could lower costs and increase output, creating a powerful incentive for technological innovation. It is within this context of agricultural surplus, available labor, and commercial capital that the first phase of industrialization, often termed proto-industrialization, emerged. This was a period, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, where industrial production began to expand significantly while still being predominantly organized in the countryside under the putting out, or domestic system. Merchants would provide raw materials, such as wool or cotton, to rural households who would then spin and weave the cloth in their own homes using simple tools like the spinning wheel and hand loom. The finished product would be collected by the merchant, who would then sell it in distant markets. This system broke the production constraints of urban guilds and tapped into the underutilized labor of rural families. While technologically primitive, the domestic system was crucial. It accustomed a large segment of the population to market-oriented production, created a class of merchant capitalists experienced in managing production chains and accessing far-flung markets, and highlighted the bottlenecks in production, most notably the inefficiency of hand spinning in keeping up with the speed of hand weaving that would later cry out for mechanical solutions. The famous technological breakthroughs of the Industrial Revolution were, therefore, not random inventions, but deliberate responses to these specific economic pressures and opportunities. The series of innovations that revolutionized the British textile industry began with John Kay's flying shuttle, which sped up the weaving process, thereby exacerbating the shortage of spun thread. This imbalance triggered a sequence of inventions aimed at the spinning bottleneck: James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Richard Arkwright's water frame, and Samuel Crompton's hybrid mule. These machines initially relied on water power, which tied factories to specific rural locations, but it was the development of James Watt's steam engine, perfected in the 1770s, that truly liberated industry from geographical constraints. The steam engine provided a reliable, powerful, and location-independent source of energy, enabling the concentration of machinery in urban mills and factories. This shift from dispersed domestic production to centralized factory production was as profound a social change as it was an economic one. It dictated the rhythms of life by the clock and the machine, creating a new discipline of labor and a new social class, the industrial proletariat. The synergistic relationship between different sectors of the economy accelerated the process. The demand for more powerful and efficient steam engines drove improvements in metalworking, particularly in the production of iron. Abraham Darby's method of smelting iron using coke instead of charcoal, refined over the 18th century, freed the iron industry from the limitations of wood fuel and provided the high-quality, affordable iron necessary for machinery, bridges, and later railways. The need to transport large volumes of coal, raw materials, and finished goods cheaply and reliably spurred a revolution in transportation. The British Canal mania of the late 18th century created an extensive network of inland waterways, drastically reducing transport costs. This was followed in the early 19th century by the railway boom, which itself further stimulated the coal and iron industries, creating a powerful feedback loop of industrial demand. Each advancement in one sector lowered costs and increased capabilities in another, creating a virtuous cycle of cumulative growth. The question of why Great Britain was the first nation to experience this breakthrough has been the subject of extensive historical debate. It was not due to a single factor, but rather a unique combination. Britain possessed abundant and easily accessible deposits of coal and iron ore, the fundamental physical ingredients of industrial power. Its political environment was stable, with a constitutional system that, following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, protected property rights and created a state receptive to commercial interests. A common law system and well-defined patent rights offered a degree of protection for innovators. Furthermore, Britain was an integrated national market, free from the internal tariff barriers that still fragmented the economies of France and Germany. Its island geography provided a natural defense, allowing it to avoid the devastating land wars that ravaged the European continent, while its powerful navy protected its maritime trade routes and colonial possessions. Critically, British society was relatively open and mobile, with a landed aristocracy that was not averse to engaging in commercial and industrial enterprise, facilitating the flow of capital and talent. The spread of industrialization to the European continent was inevitable, yet it was a delayed and differentiated process. The political and economic turmoil of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars initially hindered continental development, while Britain actively sought to protect its technological lead by prohibiting the export of machinery and the emigration of skilled artisans. However, by the early 19th century, the knowledge and techniques began to diffuse. Belgium, with its rich coal reserves, was an early adopter. In France, industrialization progressed more gradually, often maintaining a greater emphasis on luxury goods and small-scale artisanal production alongside newer factory-based industries. Germany, politically fragmented until 1871, nonetheless developed formidable industrial regions, particularly in the Ruhr Valley, and its state-sponsored development of education and heavy industry would later propel it to a position of European leadership. In all cases, the continental experience was characterized by a greater role for the state, investment banks, and deliberate technological borrowing than had been the case in the more organic and market-led British model. In conclusion, the early history of industrialization in Europe was an epochal transformation that emerged from a deep historical context. It was the product of a long gestation period in which agricultural productivity, global commerce, and proto-industrial organization created the essential preconditions. The technological innovations that defined the era in popular imagination were the catalysts that unlocked this potential, setting in motion a self-reinforcing process of economic change that centralized production, created new social classes, and unleashed unprecedented productive power. Beginning in the specific and favorable environment of 18th century Britain, this process irrevocably altered the global balance of power, setting the stage for the economic rivalries, imperial expansions, and social conflicts that would define the modern world. It was not an event, but a system coming into being, a system whose logic of growth, capital accumulation, and technological change continues to shape our lives today.